make sure it's
It
live
says it's
stream.
on.
Says it's on. I'm just waiting to see it here. Okay. I'm just going to close that. And record. Our guest today is Suzanne Roberts. Suzanne, welcome.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here with you virtually.
Suzanne Roberts is the author of the travel essay collection, Bad Tourist, Misadventures in Love and Travel. And the memoir, Almost Somewhere, 28 Days on the John Muir Trail, which was the winner of the National Book Award.
National Outdoor Book Award.
National Outdoor Book Award,
Yep.
as well as 4 books of poems named she was named the next great travel writer by National Geographic's Traveler. Suzanne's work has been listed as notable in Best American Essays and included in the Best Women's Travel Writing. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, CNN, Creative Nonfiction, Brevity, The Rumpus, Hippocampus, The Normal School, River Teeth, and elsewhere. She holds a doctorate in literature and the environment from the University of Nevada, Reno, and teaches for the low residency MFA program in creative writing at Sierra Nevada College. She served as the 2018 to 2020 El Dorado County Poet Laureate and currently lives in the South Lake Tahoe, California. So incredibly impressive bio, and super excited to have a fellow writer and fellow traveler on the show. So let's get hacking.
Okay, sounds good.
I've found that people get obsessed with their own angles and perspectives of culture from very different paths and usually from a combination of life experiences. Listeners, you've already heard a bit about my journey from growing up in a religious cult to becoming an Army captain and helping to change combat culture for women. All of those things birthed my own interest and insights into culture. If you haven't, check out episode 0 of the Culture Hacking Podcast and follow me on Twitter to see all the things I'm writing about. Today, we are going to hear Suzanne's story and insights. So please take it away.
Well, that's pretty broad, I guess. Stories and insights. Okay, so everybody heard my bio, and I definitely did not win the National Book Award. So you made me even more impressive than I might be. But I have always been a traveler and a writer, and I think now with this new book coming out, it's coming out October 1st. It's called Bad Tourist, and it sort of combines sort of my love of travel and my love of writing, and it's also a book of sort of self-discovery, of trying to figure out sort of who I am as a woman in the world. And I think we have a lot in common, Daniela, because we're doing this live thing and you're in an RV, and my husband and I are about to take off in a van and travel around the United States and Mexico and Canada and maybe down into Central America. And we're doing this. We always wanted to sort of just take off and travel, but we're doing it in a van because we have an old dog, and his name is Eli, and he's probably going to start barking any minute, but he's 14. And so that's the way we're going to travel. And so I'm super excited to hear about what your experiences are downsizing into an RV, because we're going to downsize. You know, you can see my house in South Lake Tahoe behind me. We're going to rent it out and we're going to travel. And I was just talking to somebody who said, you know, I wish I could do that. And I said, you can. You know, I mean, not everybody. I mean, I have an extremely, I have an extreme amount of privilege to be able to do this, to have been able to work at a tenured teaching job for 20 years. You know, my husband's in college administration and we've been able to save money. We're able to rent our house out. So not everyone can do this, but so many people who are sort of in that grind of work and making money and buying more things can do it. It's just the things you have to give up. So I'm in a total transition in my life right now. And so I'm really excited to hear how it goes for you, because, you know, I'd take any advice that you have.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like, one of the things I've noticed sort of from I mean, everything's culture. So it's definitely like a cultural insight, I guess, is that, it's everyone can simplify their life. So whether you can, and that's what the downsizing has really done for us. Like we're kind of staying put, at least for now. We downsized because we didn't know what is coming up in the future. We have a bunch of exciting things on the horizon and our lives are changing drastically. But when you go and you downsize and you realize, kind of to your point, right, how much money you've spent on stuff just to fill up a house, just to spend more money on stuff, and you don't need any of it. And we did this thing where we packed the top bunk like Tetris with all of my daughter's toys that we think that she needs. And in 2.5 weeks living in here, she hasn't touched it once. She's
Mhm.
played with like a few things that she has down, and we go on adventures and we do all this stuff. So that I think has been really interesting. And then, the other thing you said that kind of stands out to me is, and I think this goes into everything, is when people look at a life from the outside and say like, "Oh, well, I wish I could do that." And it's like, well, like you said, like you can,
Right.
it
And
it
not
it
everybody,
might look
but
different,
yeah.
but you can take the trip, or you can take the leap.
Hmm.
And and then of course the thing is, it's not all simple, it's not all glorious. Of course there are
Right.
challenges. I remember when we first moved into the RV, I was like, okay, somebody once said in a very great TED talk that I watched that transition is hard,
Hmm.
um, which my listeners will know was me. But I just had to keep reminding myself of that, like, this is hard, this is hard.
Yeah.
Um, Okay, so tell me a little bit about Bad Tourist. I, of course, love the title. I think some people might hate it, which is probably what you were going for, is poking at people a little bit. But you had said something to me that we all try not to be bad tourists, but then we always are. Can you
Yes.
tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that when we travel, we don't mean to bring our sort of expectations of the way things should be, or how comfortable we should be, or what we should be eating, or how long we should wait in line or wait for things, or how long public transportation should take. And so even though we're totally aware of wanting to sort of experience a culture the way it is, I think that we always tend to bring sort of our own culture with us. And that prevents us from really experiencing the new place. And I think even no matter how aware I try to be, or how open I try to be to other things, when I get tired, or when I get sick, or when things are like a bunch of things go wrong, it's like you default into sort of being your spoiled self. And so my book is 33 essays, and it makes kind of a memoiristic arc. It's not in chronological order. It's set up like a guidebook. So they're like different, like Lonely Planet sites, sleeping, eating and drinking, spas and beauty treatment activities, that kind of thing, getting there in a way. But each essay stands alone, but contributes to this sort of overall theme of really trying to be aware, self-aware, of myself in the world, and also, bringing in my white Western privilege into other places, and really making fun of myself, and hoping that I'm not making fun of other travelers. I'm only really making fun of me, but I'm hoping that other people will see themselves in that, and maybe be able to just question the way that they travel, and the way that they insert themselves into a situation. And I know I can't know all of my blind spots. So there's probably places, and I really am, and this is something I'm really interested in, especially with all the sort of debate going on right now with the American dirt, right, with this sort of appropriation of other cultures. And I'm really aware that I could be doing things like that. I could be stereotyping because I have blind spots. And so I have had a number of readers looking specifically for that, and trying to educate myself on, like, where are my own stereotypes, and what are my own preconceived notions. And it's really hard, but I think you're putting yourself out there, right? Where some readers are so mean, right? They're trolls, and their comments are so mean sometimes. And you open yourself up to that, and I'm opening myself up to that. I'm coaching myself by trying to say, like, okay, when people get angry because they read something I've written, that's kind of good, because they're seeing something they don't want to see in themselves, and anger may be the first step. And I'm not trying to say like I'm trying to teach people how to be a better tourist. I'm not. I'm just trying to sort of start a discussion around it. And there's also a lot of other themes in the book. One is relationships and women's relationships to their bodies, to being object versus subject, and within sexual desire, and then shame that comes when we do give in to our desires, which are totally normal and natural, but we've been told, right, that we're not supposed to be too hungry, right? We're not supposed to be too hungry for food or for sex or for fame, right? Oh, look at her, she's bragging about her book again, right? And so there's that, questioning that. And there's also I travel in the book with other women, and so there's a sort of theme of female friendship, which I wrote about in my first memoir, Almost Somewhere. The sort of idea of how we get along with women, and I've learned over the years how to be a really good friend, where I think in my 20s I wasn't so good at that. So that's basically the recap of it.
Well, that's amazing. I'll leave it to the, PhD in literature to make sure that like the book is full of really awesome themes because, that's how you write a bestseller. Um, I I was very fascinated when you were talking about the hunger thing, right? And how especially for women, we're not allowed to kind of have this hunger. And I feel like I've definitely noticed when you mentioned success, I wouldn't have thought about that, but there's almost like there's this blowback where people, I don't know if you've experienced this, where people try to say, oh, well, you're just trying to make money, or, oh, well, you're just trying to sensationalize so that you can get on the news, or whatever it is, almost as a way of invalidating what you're writing and what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't feel like I see that directed towards men in the same way.
You
And
don't.
I've kind of started answering it with like, yes, I do want to make money, That's
Yeah.
not why I'm doing it. Nobody, if you're writing because you want to make money, you're probably in the wrong career field.
Yeah,
But
Elizabeth Gilbert in the book Big Magic. Have you read it?
no.
It's kind of a craft book, but it's more of a book for anyone who sort of wants to live a creative life. And in it, she says something about how you can't expect your writing to support you. Your job is to support your writing. And I think that's really important. I mean, I want to sell books, but I mostly want readers. I want to connect with readers. And I know that my book's coming out with a university press. It's not going to be a bestseller, but if it connects with the people who need it, then that to me is success. But you're right. I mean, women do. I mean, especially the second something does well, right? We're heaped on with a bunch of criticism about our motives, about the way we went about something, and men don't get that as much, for sure.
Yeah, and even when you were talking about kind of like how the anger reaction is important, and I think that is especially when you're talking about, because what you're essentially talking about is socialization, and how when you travel, you start to see your blind spots and you start to see the way that you've been socialized that you didn't consider it. And the easiest example for me these days is just like mention white privilege and watch everyone start freaking out, right? Like one way or the other, like everyone's freaking out, and it's very difficult to even have the conversation without people feeling attacked, when in reality it's like, no, that's the emotion that you're feeling when the words white privilege gets mentioned. You need to plumb into that and explore that like a lot more. It's not what I'm saying that is, obviously we can have blind spots, we can have holes, but like if just the idea of this is upsetting you, that's your job to go explore. And so writing that helps people to do that, I think, is such an important part of the national conversation on culture.
Right. Well, and
International.
and I think that conversation too, first of all, it's scary to think about having the privileges you do have taken away from you, right? And that's how people feel. They feel like, oh, the things I have, well, for some reason, we believe we've earned the things we have, right? And a lot of what we have has to do with who our parents were, the educational opportunities we've had, you know, the kind of brain we have, whatever. And those are all, you know, the body, the physical body we have, those are all privileges. And some people have more, a long list. And there's a lot of white guys out there, right, who were born into poverty, who feel like, well, what, I don't have the same thing that these other white guys have. But then the very fact of being a white guy, of course, is a privilege, but there are a lot of other things that aren't, maybe. And I think a lot of that comes from fear, you know, and maybe too, the anger that people feel when they read something. I mean, I put so much stuff out there, you know, and I try not to be afraid. Like, you know, I've got one night stands in my book. I've got my own infidelity. I cheated on my first husband, and that is in my book. And when people get angry, I think maybe they also get scared. Maybe they've done something like that they don't want to face, or maybe they're afraid that someone they love has done something like that. And so anger is a way of sort of protecting yourself from fear, right? And so, you know, it'll be interesting. I don't know how the book will be received, but if the better it does, the harder it will be. I mean, part of me is scared if it does well, that, like, you know, I'm going to have to deal with the blowback. You know, I do have a friend who says he never reads comments, and if I could get to that, I would be really a lot better off, but I don't know that I will. I'm just too curious.
Yeah, so my co-writer and I that are working on my memoir now, we've made a pact that we will not read any comments, because if the good ones will find our inboxes and the bad ones don't matter. But I don't know if I'm gonna be able to hold to that.
Yeah, I think you just have to get yourself into a place where it's okay, you know, where, you know, and now with the anonymity of the internet, people can say really horrible things, and I think sometimes they just don't think that there's a person behind it, you know. Like, I mean, I was thinking about a friend of mine who had, you know, has recently had a lot of criticism, and I said to him, I said, it doesn't seem like they think you're a person. Like, you wouldn't say that to another person, right? But people do. So it's a really interesting, strange thing, the internet, and the way that writers have to sort of exist in the world in the way they didn't 30 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I've just reading the reviews on some of my favorite books gets my blood boiling so much, like with the way that people write the negative comments. I can't even imagine what it's like when it's your work and your stuff. But, you know, I think I'm starting to realize that at least this is one of the powers of memoir, right? Is you don't have to be making, like you said, like in your book, you're not trying to teach everyone else how to not be a bad tourist. You're just going through the process of learning it yourself. And I think, you know, there's power in allowing people to draw their own conclusions and see the uncomfortable light shine back on them. And that's what's gonna, you know, hopefully help people to open their minds. And I'm so, you know, admiring of the way you choose to use your own mistakes, if as it were, just experiences, you know, in the book, and let people see that. Because I think that's, you know, with I call it the culture wars that are going on right now, right? These major shifts in everything. You know, we'll watch a TV show from less than 10 years ago, and we won't be able to believe that that was acceptable on the air.
Right.
You know, like that's how drastically it's shifting. But I think like part of the reason people are scared, obviously, is losing the power, like you said. But I think part of the reason we're scared is that all of our past actions are going to come under scrutiny. And, you know, I've had people call me out. I had a close sibling of mine be like, you know, it's cool that you're an activist for military spouses now, in my case, because when you first joined the army, you said some pretty critical things. And I was like, okay, I hope that I've matured since I was 22, you know, and I, you know, if I specifically hurt someone, I apologize and I would, you know, do it again. or would apologize to them again, but being able to kind of learn from that, and learn like, oh yeah, I was very biased at the time.
Yeah.
To be like, I was wrong, but not be too embarrassed that I can't continue to move forward and be an activist and speak out. And I think that's one of the things, especially with men these days and how consent culture and how everything's changing. I think when men will tell me that men are too scared to say anything these days, that's kind of what I see, is just like, you're so worried that your past actions, which were acceptable at the time, are going to be judged now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, I I think that one of the big problems with our culture is that the people in power believe that they have to never change their mind or never admit that they did something wrong. It's like the sign of weakness. But then what happens if you don't do those things is that you don't grow and become a more intelligent, interesting, introspective human being, right? And it's an interesting thing, because I think, if men are saying I'm afraid to say anything, then that means that their thinking hasn't caught up with where it should be, because they are afraid they're going to say what they're really thinking, and what they're thinking is unacceptable, so maybe they shouldn't talk. Like, that's my opinion. Right. And I think that if they think that women, right, I mean, women should be judged on their fuckability, and that's how they believe, and they're afraid of opening their mouth because that's what they'll say, they should keep their mouth shut. That's what they should do. Right. And so I think we need more books by women that are read, right, also by men. And that's another problem, right, is where you're coming out with this book about a woman not only certainly being from a cult, but in a military background. And you are probably, I don't know, what your publicist will say in the future, but they'll probably be like, oh, we need to target women. Well, why? Target men, and then that way it increases the dialogue, and it gets men to see, like, how women are thinking about things. I mean, I certainly, some of my favorite authors are men. I love, obviously, if you read anything before 200 years ago, you were reading all men. So it's only fair, right? We should read each other,
Yeah. Well, and it's exactly what you said about the blind spots, and you just don't know,
Right.
And that's one of the powerful stories that I will tell on the stage or in my book or whatever, was like when we first started putting women into combat, and we started realizing not only had we had the wrong idea the whole time, but like we see different things.
Right.
And which, in the military intelligence world, we call indicators
Mm-hmm.
of someone trying to kill you. You see different
Right.
things. That's a really important thing to know.
Mm-hmm.
And so it took 250 years to argue about whether women were good enough to be in combat, and it only took under 1 decade to completely change the whole thing
Mm-hmm.
once we started doing it, which was, really cool. But and to your point, I mean, I am already lining up men, like strong, proud veterans, high-ranking men that will publicly like read my book and publicly sort of stand up in favor of it, because it is, it's important
Oh
for
yeah.
the men. Like, books about women are for everyone. They're not just for women. And
Right.
that's how we move the needle, and that's how we change the conversation. And
Mm-hmm.
I've had male colleagues on the veteran side actually tell me, Daniela, I never thought about any of this from a woman's perspective. They were like, I went back and asked, the woman I was deployed with to Afghanistan or to Iraq, if she experienced some of the same stuff. And she said, yes, absolutely. And I could not see it at the time. And I think when people say, okay, me too, so what? What's next? What does all this talking do? It's like, that's what it does. Because that guy, now that he knows, will call out that behavior, because that's one of the good guys. He will call out that behavior in the future. And if the woman he was serving with had felt empowered at the time to speak up about it, that guy would have been her ally. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's kind of one of my answers to, well, do all guys need to be so scared right now? It's like, no, you need to figure out what side of, history you're on, and
Mhm.
then you need to learn. And it's the same thing for us white people, right? To like learn what people of color are experiencing, what they're hearing, believe them, and then call people out when they're doing ignorant stuff.
Yeah, and I mean that's what the debate, like I mentioned earlier about American Dirt, is like, okay, it's time for us to read books by, by Mexicans, by people who have themselves, had to deal with migration and all other kinds of things. And it's like, I read something today that like something like 7% of the publishing world is like Latinx, and it's like, no, like we need everybody's story, and that's how the world is going to get better, is to hear everyone's different stories. But they're gatekeepers, right?
Yeah.
And whoever gets $1 million advance gets their book pushed into Oprah's hands. And so, I think that it's a really interesting idea to think about, like, how can I, like, share the works of writers that I've loved, that I think other people would benefit from,
Yeah. And I even noticed, so for the listeners, how I found Suzanne, it was a very interesting kind of cultural lesson for me. So I put out, I have a very like a pretty robust social media presence, and I put out on my LinkedIn and on different thing a call for guests. And I like more than 50% was white men that responded, even though I said, looking for diversity, looking for all this stuff. Of course, I got into the debates about why it was okay to say that or not. And because I do this and because I think about this all the time, I didn't stop there and just go, well, I guess there just aren't any qualified women, the whole pipeline thing. I was like, oh, I think this means that white men are just more likely to raise their hands when I
Yes.
ask for speakers. And so I went into, can't really talk about it, but this secret women's group, and I put out a call for speakers there. And I mean, in less than a day, I had to turn it off. Like I was so flooded. Which of course, tons of women wanting to speak out. And that was a really cool lesson for me. And then I, looked at my statistics again, and I was like, okay, now I need to find more minorities, more people with disabilities, more, all of these marginalized voices. And I need to go find those groups where they're at and appeal to them so that their voices don't get lost. And it's such a, kind of what you were saying, right? When we look at, historically who's been the ones whose voices have been magnified. I saw this interesting tweet about Little Women, and it was, a person of color saying, no, we don't need people of color in Little Women. We need to be asking ourselves why we're not writing more of these kinds of stories about people of color in the first place,
Mhm.
and why all of our classics are so white. It's not like we need to go back and make Joe African American. We just need to have those stories about different demographics from all throughout history, not just from right now. And I thought that was such a interesting angle that I hadn't thought about yet.
Yeah.
All right. So one more question that I had for you. What do you think, since we're on the bad tourist thing, I'm gonna keep it with your branding. What is the best thing you can do, anyone can do, to not be a bad tourist?
Well, I think one thing you could do if you're going to visit is try to learn a little bit of the language. So I've spent many years studying Spanish. I'm still not very good at it, but I can definitely, converse when I travel to Spanish speaking countries. And I think it's really important because I think that we end up stereotyping people if we can't talk to them. We make assumptions about who they are, and what their beliefs even might be, or their thoughts or whatever, because we can't talk to them and find out. And we can't expect them to speak English, right? And I'm talking about us in the United States. Many places do speak English, and I think that has caused people who live in the United States to feel like it's okay to only be monolingual. But I think learning another language is a very, very big thing you can do. I also think that trying to figure out how to be a guest versus a tourist. So a couple of years ago, I went to Morocco, and my husband and I traveled. We did sort of the, the typical go to Marrakesh, go see the markets, that kind of thing. And as a tourist, our only interaction with people were people who were selling us things or serving us things or doing things for us. It's not a real relationship. You don't get to know people that way at all, right? And so sort of this idea of of being somewhere for a short amount of time, right? And then going somewhere and be like, oh, everybody's so friendly. Well, they're friendly because they're paid to be, right? And that's not a good way to be a traveler. A good way is to be a guest. So when we were in Morocco, I ended up hooking up with a writer that I met online called, his name is El Habib. And he took us to his family's Berber village. And it was like completely off the tourist track. I mean, there was, nobody, no other tourists there. And when we walked around the town, there were people actually looking out their windows and kind of following us because they were like, and I said, what are they doing? And he said, oh, they're really interested in the Christians. And I was like, well, I'm Jewish. He says, oh, don't say that, right? But to us, right, again, stereotypes, like we're, some people we must be the Christians. So we stayed with his family, we ate with them. And interestingly, it took me a couple of days for me to realize that I ate with all the men, right? While the women ate in the kitchen, because I was his guest and my husband and I, and I was like, well, wait a minute, but they didn't want, it was sort of like being a Western woman put you in a totally different category. And so we traveled with him, and he, took us to the markets, and we went shopping with him, and we made food with him, and we stayed in his family house, his apartment, and then his grandmother's house. And it was this hugely different experience. I went from thinking, I don't ever want to come back to Morocco again, because there was everybody haggling with the, snake charmers and the, everything. And I just was so overwhelming, to my husband and I thinking about moving there. Right.
Wow.
We were like, this is so beautiful. It's so beautiful here. The food's so great. The people are so wonderful, because we were guests. We were not typical tourists coming in like on a cruise ship to walk around and look at things and take photographs and put them on Instagram and call it a day. So I think in order to be, I don't know if there's such a thing as a good tourist, but in order to not be a bad tourist, I think you have to spend more time, and you have to have real relationships with people that aren't just based on them serving your coffee or your breakfast or whatever. So those are my pieces of advice.
Yeah. And I mean, combine that with what you said earlier about self-reflection, about ways our attitudes come out when we're tired, or,
Yeah.
I forget how you said it, but like what our spoiled habits are, which is, yeah, that's something that I'm going to try to remember really hard while I'm on my trip. I was thinking, though, this is such a great episode to be recording. Like literally next Monday, I'm getting on a plane with my family, and we're going abroad for 2 months. So this is actually like, it's getting me excited, but it's getting me in the mindset. And kind of to your point, with language and also being a guest, I'm excited. What we've done is, so I'm raising my daughter in Brazilian Portuguese. So she's 4 and she speaks Portuguese. And the thing with, anywhere you go, language is so important to people, right? It's tied up in their identities. But with Brazil specifically, like they get so lumped in with Spanish that just the fact that, and that it's Portuguese is already impressive. I always tell my friends, they say, can you give me a list of Portuguese words? And I'm like, I'll give you a list of Portuguese words and teach you how to not say them in Spanish, and they will love you. But I'm excited because I'm bringing this little 4-year-old with blonde hair down to her waist who speaks Portuguese as her first language. And I just know that is going to be the portal into us meeting and having amazing conversations. I've actually had to warn my husband, like, you need to be prepared that we're going to be invited to dinner in people's houses all the time, because of our daughter is like this little cultural bridge, which is.
Yeah. There's a great book you should read. A friend of mine wrote, Camille Dungy. She wrote a book called Guidebook to Relative Strangers. And it's about sort of traveling through the United States as a Black woman, but she brings her little girl, and her little girl sort of creates these like bridges and situations, and the book is about a lot of other things too, but it definitely is a book about motherhood and traveling with children, and it's a beautiful book. So you should bring it for
Yeah.
your plane
I
ride. I
I
think you'll
will.
enjoy it.
I'm gonna
Yeah.
buy it right away.
Hmm.
And yeah, I think with children, like anything with children, but travel or any of these hard questions, I feel like kids just come up with the easiest answers.
Hmm.
So my daughter, like the entire Latin community and Latin countries are debating how gendered their language is and what they can do to fix it and if they can do anything to fix it.
Right.
Meanwhile, my daughter has no patience for it. You will say amigos y amigas. It's not that hard, mom. Like and she really has taught me like, oh yeah, it's not that hard. Like we don't need to
Right.
just default male. We can just take 2 more seconds to be inclusive.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's awesome. I love the things that like little tiny kids can just teach us how to be better humans.
Right. I agree. Yeah.
That's awesome. Tell me that author's name again for the
Camille
record.
Dungy,
Camille Dungy.
Dungy.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So definitely we're going to check that out. We're going to check out Big Magic. All of the links and things that we mentioned will be linked in the show notes in the actual podcast when this airs. If you're watching it live, hopefully you took notes. Thank you so much, Suzanne. This was super interesting. And for sure, let's check out Suzanne's writings. We'll probably post this podcast in around April, and then maybe again in October when your book comes out. Help you get that bestseller. We're gonna
Oh.
we're gonna make it happen.
Oh, well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
You, me, and Oprah.
Yeah.
I've also heard that if you can get the president to tweet negatively about you, then your book will immediately sell out. So.
Oh, well, there's something. Although I don't know if I can stomach going on his Twitter. So.
Yeah, you and me both. Well, all right. So, Suzanne, even though you've already given us tons of advice, we like to end the show with one tactical, I call culture hack, but basically favorite tip of your life that you think people can take away from this and implement in their world today.
I think, and I'm not always good at this myself, but I think if I would say anything as far as a culture hack is to try to come from a place of kindness and figure out how you can help. I was recently in England, in my mother's hometown, which is Blackpool, northern England, and there was a mother, and she was dragging this little 18-month-old, who was screaming, and she was so like at the end of her, just she had no patience left, and she's screaming at this kid, and it's making things worse, and the kid's finally like face down in the puddle, like screaming in the street. And of course my first thought was like, oh my god, why is this person a mother, right? The first thought was like the mean thought, was like the judgmental thought, was the like not kind, not empathetic thought. And I thought, well, I have to go over there and do something, right? So I sort of were looking around. Other people were like, well, there's nothing we can do. And I thought, there's something we can do. So I walked over there thinking, I don't know what I'm going to say or what I'm going to do, but I'm going to go over there. So by the time I got there, she was sitting on the ground crying. The little girl was screaming. The little boy who was autistic was talking about something, I don't know what. And she had her total single mom, had her hands full, like both kids were sick. The little boy, as I mentioned, has autism. And I walked over to her and I just said to her, can I help you? Can I help you? And she said, okay. And I said, can I touch your child? And she said, yes. And I picked up the little girl, and she had like this thing tied around her wrist, she was kind of being dragged, and I untightened it, and the little girl hugged me, and I was like, can I hug your child? She's like, yeah. And so the little girl's crying and hugging me, and I ended up walking with her for quite a way back, holding the little girl. She's, using the the pram, and got to talking to her about how hard her life is, and it would have been so much easier for me to just be like, oh my God, she shouldn't have children, like she's, like I don't know anything about being a single mom. I don't know anything about living in a, depressed northern British city, but I knew that she needed help, and I don't always act the right way, and that was one time when I realized that I just had to act out of kindness and ask her if she needed help, and she did. And I think that that's what you do. Maybe you're an asshole in your mind and you're judging someone, but stop it and figure out how to help. That's my advice.
That's so great. That's, I feel like I talk with this about my husband all the time, like what this story would look like to somebody driving by, like what they're going home and telling their spouse versus what's actually happening.
Hmm.
So when you were telling that story, like I had a moment where my husband was in Afghanistan. He was a special operations helicopter pilot.
Hmm.
Um, we met because I was the intelligence officer for helicopters. So I am an expert on the people trying to kill him. It's a Saturday morning. I'm in the store with my 1-year-old. We're in like Target or something, and I get a phone call, and they say there's been an accident, and on cue, my baby starts screaming, my heart stops, like everything is, you hear the words dead pilot, like everything stops. And I could see people around me like staring as I'm like oblivious mom on the phone while my baby is just like screaming in a cart. We end up I just walking out, turns out like he was fine, but it was not him, but it was someone else.
Hmm.
This is like a big deal. It's like a really bad day. We walk out, I get to the car, I notice all the unpaid for stuff in my cart. It's like total mess. And I'm just like, I imagine like people watching that literally saying, this woman should not have
She's a
children.
mess. Yeah.
With like no clue what's going on,
Yeah.
and I've also had days where, I'm in a store and she's throwing a fit and someone walks by and is just like, hey, I've been there,
Yeah.
and I'm just like, there's no way they can know, that like daddy's at war. This is why this is so hard. But that one act of kindness is like makes all the difference.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think that's all it is. It's just trying to be kind when you can. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
What's a great quote I've heard before was, everybody is mourning something. You
It's
know,
true.
it's just like having, we are always so tied up in what's going wrong in our lives that just knowing that like everybody's sad about something. And
Hmm.
so just be kind. That's awesome.
Yeah.
That'll probably be one of the titles of our episode. So, well, thank you so much. I feel
Thank
like we
you.
could talk forever.
Thank you.
This has been really great, really illuminating, and I can't wait to see and read your book.
Yeah, likewise. Likewise. So,
Awesome. Thanks
all
so much to the listeners. Stay tuned and let's get hacking.